This episode of the podcast is generously hosted by Progressive Equity Research. Visit their website at progressive-research.com. Hello and welcome to episode 30 of the Desert Island Investor. This is a two-part podcast. In part one, which we've already released, Mark talks about his investment in MPE Evans, who are a producer of sustainable palm oil. And in this part two, he's going to recount his experience of visiting an MPE Evans plantation on Bangka Island in Indonesia. Mark, you are in Indonesia, having completed the site visit of Bangka Mill and Plantation. So how did it go?
Well, to perhaps set the tone, and I'm not saying this as it's the most recent event in my memory, but without doubt, this has to have been one of my very best life experiences, Paul.
Oh, wow, that's some statement. Perhaps you'd like to share how this visit came about then, because we've been obviously working on this for quite some time.
Well, this has been around 8 months in the making, and I'm always planning forward. It started in May of last year. Elaine and I planned to part winter in Mauritius as usual, and then after a short break at home, try another location. And amongst the shortlist was Indonesia. And I said if we could secure a visit to one of the MPE Evans plantations, then that would be the clincher. I contacted the company and asked if we went to Indonesia, would it be possible to visit one of our plantations in February? I explained that I was personally interested, but would also look to share with our audience as this podcast special. Now, whenever I've posted material at MPE Evans, it's always had a very strong following. I stated again that I thought that there was a lot of misinformation about palm oil, and that we could perhaps help rebalance this in some small way, especially in the absence of many other parties pushing back. And it's a little bit like Edmund Burke. All that is necessary for evil to triumph is that good men do nothing. So what were the terms of engagement? I pointed out that I wasn't looking for any freebies, that was my word, and that all the costs would be borne by me. I wasn't interested in a jolly, but this would be a fact-finding mission. And I stress this would not be a company-sponsored on-message type production. I will be free to cover any aspects of the visit as I saw fit. However, given my feelings towards the company, I did envisage that it would be in a positive light.
And what was the response?
Well, it was explained that February is not a good time and that they're not geared up for drop-in visits, which I can fully appreciate. However, it was explained that Matthew Coulson, the CEO, and Luke Shaw, the CFO, will be visiting one of the plantations in January and will be delighted to accompany me. So, result, a visit, but also access to the board. Now, unfortunately, the date suggested overlapped with us being in Mauritius, so Lane and I had to abridge our time in Mauritius by several days, forfeit our return flight to the UK, and arrange our flights from Mauritius to Indonesia, giving ourselves, several days ahead of the visit to make sure that we were match fit. And I said this just to emphasise, the commitment that we put into this project.
I mean, it's clear then that this would not have occurred without you taking that initiative.
Well, having had a career in sales for 35 years, you learn to reach out and take the initiative and learn to do this, knowing that you're not always going to succeed, and you take your fair share of knockbacks. But, this is how opportunities arise for yourself. Now, in nearly all other professions, the work is presented to, something lands on your desk, in your inbox, or warehouse operative is told what needs to be picked. Transport manager is given products that need delivering. A credit controller has overdue payments to chase. Purchasing manager is told that so many things need to be bought. Very seldom is a salesperson given the luxury of a customer presenting themselves in front of him or her and says, I want to buy from you. I used to say jokingly to my colleagues that salespeople need strategy and tactics like carnivores. They need these tactics to capture their prey. All other departments are herbivores. And I used to say it's no coincidence that carnivores have bigger brains, Paul.
Right. Okay. Where did you meet Matthew and Luke? Was that at the plantation?
Well, if we rewind a little, we spent 4 days in Jakarta ahead of that, and this is relevant to the site visit. We were actually able to experience what life was like in Indonesia, albeit one place, the capital city, and this was act as a point of reference ahead of our site visit. Now, on the taxi ride from the airport to the hotel, we witnessed a lot of poor housing, shanty-esque, rustic corrugated metal roofs, hardly a right angle in sight. Yes, there's pockets of affluence and some very high-end shopping complexes, but these are the exceptions, and there really is a big disparity between the rich and the poor. Now, one day we walked 10 miles from our hotel to Jakarta Bay, and here we saw the full gamut. We witnessed extreme poverty, but at the same time, a real entrepreneurial spirit. Now, many families were literally sharing their homes with poultry, and we walked past row after row of businesses. Now, given the number of motorcycles, there's a lot of repair shops, metalworking, food stalls, key cutting booths, timber, metal, bamboo stockists. Some were hardly what you could call a shop, a kiosk or a stall, anything to try and eke out or scrape a living. And there's lots of repair businesses. Presumably, this is given the unit labour costs, they cannot indulge themselves in a disposable society. And we did see quite a lot of recycling. Two men were actually dismantling light bulbs to salvage some form of value from them. And we needed some laundry doing and saw lots of laundry services are advertised. And one was just minutes from our hotel. And as we followed the sign, it was to somebody's home. And the lady had a washing machine, lines, ironing board, and an iron, and therefore had the accoutrements to establish a business. And we took advantage of the express same-day service as we were moving on to Bangka the next day. And we had to pay a double for this. And 4 hours later, our clothes were ironed and bagged pristinely for £1.50. I'm far from trying to condescend or sneer or ridicule the Indonesian people. They are battling to improve their lot. And the main reason why there is such a disparity between what I enjoy and what they do is not down to anything I've had any control over. It's simply the lucky sperm lottery of where we're born. However, in my conversations, both with everyday Indonesians and later with the MPE Evans staff, there's a strong sense that things are improving and they're better off than their parents, and it's expected that that'll be the case with their own children. And if you think things are improving, this gives great solace even from a low base. Now, this perhaps contrasts with the UK, where after generations like myself, the baby boomers, things are tougher in many different ways. Try getting on the housing ladder, for example. And, Indonesia has a fragile economy. Just imagine if one of their major industries, palm oil, was interfered with, what the ramifications of this would be, and for and for their population. And in Indonesia, they don't have that luxury of self-indulgence. Every rupiah is a prisoner.
So you eventually met up with the MP Evans team?
Yes, we met at Jakarta Airport ahead of the flight to Bangka. And from MP Evans were, as I said, Matthew Coulson and Luke Shaw, the CEO and CFO respectively, and also Ravi. That's Ravi Chandran Krishna Pillai. He's the president director of PT Evans Indonesia. He's the top man in Indonesia and very much the top brass. And it actually reminds me of a conversation I had with Matthew at the last AGM. And I said to him, do you and Luke actually fly out to Indonesia together? And it may have been a little bit delicate, but Matthew said, I think I know where you're going with this. And given the nature of MP Evans is constructed, if anything happened to Matthew and Luke as they were flying together, then would anything happen to the business? And he said, no, anybody else coming in will pick up the thread pretty quickly. And I thought that was very generous of Matthew. Lots of people like to think or try to suggest that they're indispensable to the business, but it's a further comfort to know that MP Evans are far from being leader dependent. Let us remember this business has been in existence for in excess of 150 years. So that was just another example of insight that can be obtained by attending an AGM and speaking in person away from the formal part of the meeting.
And I understand that on this visit you were part of a larger group.
Yes, in no particular order. There was Harriet Kildall, ESG manager at Inspired ESG, consultants on these matters. And then there was Nigel Harker and Ross Nelson of the auditors BDO. And then Matt Good, Tim Redburn and Nigel Parson of their NOMAD, their nominated advisor Cavendish, with Matt being the actual NOMAD. So when Elaine and I met Matthew and Luke at the airport, we found out that the whole group had coalesced gradually over a couple of days, with ourselves being the last attendees. So to break the ice, I said it reminded me a little bit of I'm Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, with the group of all bonded and getting on well together. And then they drop in two obnoxious and annoying people into the mix. And in short measure, everybody's turning on one another. So I thought that may have been our role. Now, the MP Evans aspect aside, it was an added opportunity to spend 3 to 4 days rubbing shoulders with these people, being able to ask questions, listening and learning, exchanging ideas, understanding their skill sets, and discussing certain businesses in my portfolio that they've been involved with. And that really was great value. It was a window into their world, and I enjoyed the company a great deal. And I was able to take a lot from each, and that really was an added bonus. Now, at the airport, to manage expectations, I reinforced that Elaine and I were very much there to work, and our expectations were that we were on some kind of theme park. And as it turned out, this was very much a working group and not a corporate entertaining knees up, which was in keeping with exactly what we were looking to achieve. So we spoke at length of the research I conducted, and was able to ask the first of many, many questions. So then it was a short flight then out to Bangka Island.
Okay, so what was your first port of call when you arrived?
Well, there was something of a nautical theme, as we actually did the site visit in slightly reverse order. We first visited the bulking station with the CPO, the crude palm oil that is stored ahead of it being shipped by tanker to the refineries. And it gave a sense of scale, and there was a tanker docked at the end of the jetty from where it would transport the CPO to the relevant refinery. MP Evans are very strong, they're very hot on health and safety, and we're given very clear instructions on how to act. And it was imperative we took personal responsibility, and we had to wear protective helmets, boots and gloves, and they were especially welcome when we saw the warning signs for crocodiles, Paul. So we were in a convoy of 5 4x4s, and throughout the visit, Elaine and I were always joined by Ravi, who, let us remember, is ultimately responsible for 12,800 employees. So that's not bad for a man whose father was a tractor driver. And he never tired or outwardly appeared to tire of those endless questions of mine. And I was struck not only by his deep knowledge, but also his deep passion for the business. And over the 4 days we spent together, I'd like to think I've developed a new friendship. It was some distance between the bulking station to the mill, and as we entered the plantation in convoy with the rain falling and surrounded by trees, it did feel a little bit like Jurassic Park.
Okay, by comparison to your visits to this plantation, I believe you have an anecdote regarding a site visit that you once witnessed when you worked at the paper mill.
This dates back, Paul. So I will be in my late 20s and in sales at Star Paper Mill in Fenny-Skulls, Blackburn. And we'd been owned by a Finnish paper company, Kimini, and we were sold to Sappi, or our South Africans. Now, there were structural changes affecting the paper industry, but also internally, things were not going well. We had production problems and turning out ton after ton of substandard paper, not even fit to be sold as clearance paper known as retreat. It was only going to be suitable for repulping and having another attempt to get it right. Now, the mill was littered with these reels of paper. It was indoors, outdoors, people having to walk round it, climb over it, picture the scene. So it was announced that the big cheese from Sappi, a Finn called Kim Jokapi, will be making a day visit to Blackburn Mill. Clerk of Works Tommy Aspin was soon instructing places to be swept, painted. Suddenly I noticed a number of long-term broken windows being repaired. It was a hive of activity. But what about all those tons of defective paper? Jokapi would soon find out what was going on and rightly go bananas at being kept in the dark. The decision made by the top management of Blackburn Mill, this is what they did. They hired lorry after lorry of external transport, which was at great cost, loaded up the paper and instructed them to park up outside the mill. Jokapi made his flying visit, seemed suitably pleased, and as he pulled out of the mill, the lorries came back in short order. It was lucky he didn't speak to one of the people on the shop floor. The mill looks tidy. Well, you should have seen it yesterday. Now, I was not involved in this subterfuge, but it struck me the madness of the whole endeavour, concealing the truth and at great cost. This is not how to run a business, and I was soon out looking for alternative employment. Now, I always thought there were merits in making an unannounced site visit, so there's no window dressing, or a more in-depth visit where you witness warts and all. Now, this is worthy of comment because the Bangka mill visit ran across 4 days, where we stayed throughout. We stayed throughout on site at accommodation at the clubhouse chalets within the plantation, and we were up for a working breakfast at 7 a.m. and it was non-stop until 9:30 or 10 p.m. By that time we were suitably shattered. Now, given the length of time we were there and the access we had to speak to such a broad spectrum of employees, not just the top management, MP Evans would have been unable to stage manage anything on this scale. The mask and the veneer would soon drop and we would have been able to see behind the wizard's curtain. You cannot attempt to ensure that so many employees will be on message and have pre-prepared answers for any number of questions. So Matthew, Luke and Ravi were very relaxed and never anxiously looking over their shoulder in case somebody was spilling the beans. There was simply nothing to hide.
So then it was on to the plantation.
Yes, we were joined during our stay by another member of the senior management, Guna. That's Guna Sikaran Uthirada. And like Ravi, he was very obliging and welcoming with our questions, which I'm sure were very elementary questions for him. And he was very generous, and we had some very good conversations. And I hope Ghana will forgive me in sharing that he's beyond retirement age, which is 55 actually in Indonesia. And they have a successor lined up, but Ravi has continually managed to coax, plead, and implore Guna to stay on, such as his experience. And I'm sure Ravi will forgive me in sharing some personal conversations, but he was almost eulogizing about Guna, and this was another theme I've discovered, was the respect that people had for others within the organisation who were very, very good at their job. And this wasn't just top management, down through the organogram. And I know Paul, I would say of you, Paul produces some good marketing on occasions, or you would say to me, that's a nice piece of business you've won, Mark. Just be interesting to see how long you hang on to it. So that's a bit of a contrast. So I asked Ravi about his job, and he said it was very difficult as he was following in the footsteps of, his word was a legend, Chandra Sikaran. And Chandra is now a non-exec. But if you look at the progress that MP Evans have made over the years and that growth curve, Chandra is credited with being front and centre of this. He set the bar so high that Ravi said that it's not easy to surpass what is inherited, and there are very few easy wins. And let's just take that figure of tonnes per hectare that we used to demonstrate the superior yields from palm over the equivalents, and the extra land that will be required. Soy is 0.4 tonnes per hectare, coconut, rapeseed, and sunflower at 0.7, and palms 3.3. But let's remember that that's an average. MP Evans are actually yielding 5.5 tonnes per hectare. So naturally, with that 3.3 tonnes, with that being an average, there's going to be people below that. So MP Evans are actually doing twice. They're twice as productive as others. So obviously, that will mean less land is necessary to sustain, humanity's needs. And you can see Chandra's legacy and probably the poison chalice that he's passed on to Ravi.
Now, fertiliser costs have been a major outlay, and you took a look at their warehouse, didn't you?
Yes, bag after bag of different fertilisers, and given the focus on recycling, I did ask if they recycled the actual bags, and was told that they use the empty bags on the plantation, which they use, that they place the fallen fruit on them so it doesn't come into direct contact with the ground. Now, sure enough, on our tour, they were either on the floor or rolled up and stored under little protective shelters. Now, that's better than recycling, Paul, because that's got a secondary use and then a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, until they eventually disintegrate. So this is helping the carbon footprint. And often beside these little shelters for the bags, you see some kind of basic trellis with some flowers growing up there. And what in my ignorance I thought were there for decoration was actually there to attract bugs and insects away from the palm trees as a decoy. So attracting pests away from the palms, this is a better and cheaper way than pesticides. We were given a demonstration on the spreading of the fertiliser by a tractor, and also told that in the terraced areas, this has to be done manually, and therefore there is some forethought into how much fertiliser a worker has to carry at a single point, as if they set up and they're overburdened. They'll jettison as much as they can at the first trees, and as they work their way around, at the end there might not be much left. So it's very much thought out. And then, when the palm fronds are cut down, they're placed at the foot of the palm to retain moisture and left to decompose. And during the milling process, after the fruit has been extracted from the bunches, that they go to the composting area where they're sprayed and turned. And we saw the end result again with these being applied to the base of the trees. Now, it did look like quite a heap, but I was shown a tree where the compost had been applied a year previously, and this had very noticeably broken down and hardly visible. And typically when a tree reaches maturity or around 25 years, by virtue that it becomes too tall to harvest, it's felled and chipped and goes back into the ground. And that's the circle of life, and how the earth is fed through the fertilizer and the tree itself. I did ask if there's any commercial value in the actual timber instead of chipping, and I was told that they'd not found one, but they would be very interested should one arise. So if anybody has an idea, please get in touch. I have a farmer friend, Donald, who grows hay for smallholders and people with horses, and he'd been lamenting the price of fertiliser. And he said he was tempted to skip a year, but not two, as it would catch up with him, and his yield would ultimately result in being counterproductive. And I asked if MP Evans were ever tempted to skimp and what the effects were. Now, there are no immediate, but there are delayed subsequent effects from not applying fertiliser. And interestingly, when a palm approaches the end of life, then they cease applying the fertiliser, as this is something that they will not benefit from any longer. And it's also something to consider during acquisitions, because it's not always obvious if the seller has been skimping or not applying any fertiliser. And this has got to be a consideration during negotiations. So involving components, beyond fertiliser, there's very little to receive at the gates and very little inventory. There's not a lot of recycling of packaging like many other businesses.
And I believe they have a biomass plant.
Yes, even the kernel shells are thrown into the furnace. Following the cooking process, the methane is burnt to form electricity, and this is used by the mill. It's using workers' homes at a price that is subsidised, and the excess is sold to the national grid. It's another good news story. Indonesia is a very hot country anyway, but the heat produced in the mill was very demanding, especially whilst we were wearing all that protective apparel, Paul.
Well, it's beginning to sound like quite a green operation.
I think they're trying to do as much as they can. In our car, there had metal water bottles or flasks with MP Evans stenciled onto them. And I remarked to Ravi that it looked very good, and he said that all staff have been issued with one in order to negate the need for plastic bottles. I found detail on that level.
And I believe you spent some time discussing the cultivation and harvesting.
Bangka is all mature hectarage. Ravi and Guna explained the planting growth cycle, and lots of this is down to seed type selection and the harvesting process. We're shown male and female flowers, and it was explained that the standard is 136 trees per hectare. So with 65,000 hectares in the group, I was quickly reverse calculating through my shareholding how many trees actually belong to me, and wondered if I could put stickers on them. So we witnessed harvesting of bunches from trees of different heights and this different skill set and apparatus that was necessary. And typically following a bunch being harvested, a ground harvester would gather any loose fruits and nothing went to waste. And this could typically be a husband and wife team, so no escape for the poor fellow Paul. We were shown the composition of the fruit with the inner nuts containing the kernel. Then these aren't processed as in-house as MP Evans don't have a kernel crusher, and these are sold unprocessed at the factory gate. So although they're from the same fruit, the two are chemically and nutritionally different. Now, palm trees are a hardy, consistent species with few pests, but I was introduced to something I was previously unaware of, Ganoderma, and this is a fungus that affects the palms and apparently usually manifests itself during the second generation of palms. Now, the symptoms are discoloration and wilting on the leaves, and the course of action is the tree is what they call deboned, and the root system is taken up. And we were shown, as they used to say on Blue Peter, one that they prepared earlier, and there was a whole 1.5 metres across and deep. And the Ganoderma is treated by simply chipping the whole tree and exposing it to sunlight. And the problem is that once you take down a tree, you cannot plant a replacement, as it wouldn't be able to receive enough sunlight through the canopy of its neighbours. So the land must be left fallow until the next full replanting of that section. And again, this is a threat to the business, and Guna and Ravi made us aware it's contagious to the crop, but there's no attempt to conceal this from us. Quite the reverse. They wanted to explain it. Ravi explained that the KPIs for the harvesters, and if they were targeted simply by weight of crop, then they may well harvest unripe bunches, and this would result in lower yields. So it's important that they're targeted by yield as well as volume.
Now, the staff live within the plantation, so what kind of facilities do they enjoy?
Well, firstly, the housing is light years ahead of what I witnessed in Jakarta. Robust and tidy with gardens. And on our walk around, we were asked if we would like to inspect the interior of a particular home, which seemed something of an infringement. However, it became evident that declining would have offended the harvester and his wife, and we duly went inside. Very well appointed, Wi-Fi and all the electrical appliances that we'd expect at home, Paul, with a sound system with speakers that look like something from Stonehenge. We visited the creche and saw the children listening to a story. They were craning, starfishing flat out on play mats, and my particular favourite were the baby hammocks suspended from the ceiling by springs, gently bobbing up and down. And I'm personally looking for one of those that can support 13.5 stone. There was a doctor and a nurse on site and a dedicated clinic, cooperative store, vegetable plots, growing things I was very envious of, pineapple being one of them. On some of the more remote plantations, there's schools, mosques and churches. However, these are not required due to Bangka's proximity to the outside villages, but the company nevertheless provided a school bus, and we saw it returning with the children. Multi-purpose sports court, and we were actually taken outside of the plantation to a neighbouring village to see a bridge spanning the river that MP Evans had paid for, and this was overseen by Ravi, who's a civil engineer by trade. And the village is actually something of really of a hamlet, but there seemed a disproportionate number of shops, and this is because on their doorstep, they've got all those MP Evans employees with that money to spend and help the immediate local economy. Then there's the excellent clubhouse that we were staying at with a tennis court, pool and table tennis table, and also facilities for providing entertainment. So plenty of good deeds, and probably in a way a modern Indonesian equivalent of the pioneering modern villages that were lauded in the UK. Things like Bourneville with Cadbury, Port Sunlight, Unilever, and Saltaire built by Titus Salt.
Now, further good work is being done through their Biodiversity programme.
This is a very new initiative, but reflecting its importance, David Wilkinson is directly involved, and he joined us online from Malaysia. Now, David has been another very senior player within the company across many disciplines, and you'll find his fingerprints everywhere. So, coordinating the programme is Nadia Nafarisa Camilla, and we were also joined by Dr. Carl Treholt, who's a Dane, but he also lives in Malaysia, and they're acting as a consultant. I believe he's a zoologist. So MP Evans have put in a lot of resource behind this, and they are developing hedgerows, which we inspected, and these are already attracting butterflies and other bugs and insects. Now, quite conveniently, these are being placed underneath the telephone wires, which are not viable to grow palms due to the height. So there's no loss of usable land. And there are already barn owls, but there's no little natural habitat, and they're supported by boxes. And it's hoped that once these hedgerows develop, then they'll provide a natural cover for the owls. Now, it's not wholly altruistic, as the hope is that they'll be able to control the rat population. That given the calorific content of the palm, rats quite like these. But as I understand, the rats are quite ponderous, so it could be a bit of an even contest. And as well as palm, tin mining is another major industry, and this leaves considerable damage to the land. This is surface mining, and it's very sandy and prone to water erosion, and it's difficult to reverse without human involvement. And again, we were taken to an area on the state that was previously mined for tin, and this has been reclaimed as part of their biodiversity program, with topsoil being deposited and various grasses and plants being introduced. And we saw some of the neighbouring land that's still being mined for tin, and that was in stark contrast to what was on the MP Evans side of the boundary. The Biodiversity Project is an embryo project which the company hoped to learn from, with any unintended consequences, and following this is intended that it will be rolled out across the group.
And did you see any orangutans?
No, Paul, there were never any orangutans on Bangka Island. They are only found in Sumatra and Borneo. MP Evans has plantations there too, but to reiterate the point that we've covered in the previous podcast, they do not deforest or clear greenfield land in those locations either. This is obviously a key requirement of the RSPO.
Okay, well, we did cover the concept of sustainability in some detail in part 1 of this podcast. So, based on what you learned from your visit, does palm oil produced by MP Evans meet the requirements to be called sustainable palm oil?
Well, I found a piece online by Rainforest Concern headed Unsustainable Agriculture, and it says, much of the fruit, cereals and pulses we buy from tropical countries have been grown in areas where tropical rainforests once thrived. The forests are cut down to make way for vast plantations where products such as bananas, palm oil, pineapple, sugarcane, tea and coffee are grown. As with cattle ranching, the soil will not sustain crops for long, and after a few years, the farmers have to cut down more rainforest for new plantations. Now, from what I've been told by MP Evans, Paul, as long as the soil is constantly nourished with fertiliser and compost, oil palms can grow in perpetuity just like any other crop: potatoes, turnips, green beans. Of course, to earn their sustainable palm oil badge, the company has had to mitigate all potential threats to the sustainability of their operation. And they've not only done this, but they've had to go the extra mile in every aspect. The palm oil industry has really been singled out for uncompromising scrutiny in Indonesia. For example, another crop grown on Bangka Island is white pepper. Admittedly, it's not on the same scale as palm, but presumably this takes up hectares of what used to be rainforest. I don't hear of people clamouring for sustainable pepper, or that consumers are boycotting pepper due to historical deforestation, or because some natural wildlife has been displaced. MP Evans has done more than many companies to ensure that its operation is up to social and environmental standards, and I'd like to see that achievement more widely recognised by manufacturers and consumers.
Now, I did find some criticism of the RSPO's auditing procedure on a website which was aimed at ethical consumers. And arguably, some industry certification bodies are really just set up to obscure poor practices. That ratification from a seemingly independent body is something which their members are happy to pay a significant amount of money for. But the RSPO fees are not that expensive, so there's no real financial incentive for them to allow mill and plantation owners to remain as members if they fail an audit.
I asked Ravi about the RSPO, and once you pay, I asked the question, once you pay your membership, are you simply a member and then you enjoy marking your own homework? And I searched online and found companies that had their membership terminated from the RSPO, and Ravi told me that certain companies had voluntarily left as they could not or weren't willing to meet the exacting standards. So Ravi sat me down and talked me through the auditing process, and he started with labour. And are they're paying at least the minimum wage? There has to be no child labour. Are they observing the national labour laws, including working hours? Is there safety helmets, gloves, and all the general PPE are provided and worn? And the safety practices followed. There's medical checkups up to 3 times annually. They inspect the facilities for workers, the cleanliness, the size of the accommodation. Is there fresh drinking water? And they ensure that the government's CPO certification of origin is required for crops sent to the mill. There's a premium paid for CPO certified crops. New planting must be approved by the RSPO. Deforestation of greenfield and burning is not allowed. Some brownfield is allowed. New land cannot be acquired by force, and fair payment must be made. Scheme smallholders must be treated fairly and are interviewed in private. And they assess what CSR projects are being undertaken. And depending on the size of the plantation, there's between 5 and 7 auditors, and these are always a mix of people sent from Malaysia and from within Indonesia. And these audits last between 5 and 10 days. And they're free to go. These auditors are free to go and speak to who they wish, and this is without management intervention. And if they find a non-compliance, MPMs or any other member of the RSPO are given 90 days to take remedial action. So this was a lot clearer to me, and I maintain that sustainability is misleading. Yeah, yes, MP Evans are producing small s sustainable palm oil, but they also have to reach high ethical and responsible standards in addition to this in other areas. Now, I did ask Ravi if they'd ever experienced any non-compliance, and in typical candid fashion, he said yes. They'd experienced one at Bangka, where during the heavy harvesting period, as an oversight, some truck drivers had exceeded their working hours limit, and they'd probably known that themselves and kept quiet, as they're keen to do as much overtime as possible. But following this, not only have MP Evans tightened up their monitoring, but they also had to obtain extra trucking capacity, and they had to prove this to the auditors.
Okay, looking at the figures, I had noticed that the yields do differ slightly from mill to mill. What's the reasoning for that?
Across the group, there's varying performance levels, and these are often climate-driven in a particular year. And I asked if the plantation saw themselves as competitors and holding back on sharing ideas to be top dog. Now, Ravi said this was far from the case, and it was very collegiate. There's a cross-fertilisation of employees, and they shared best practice, and they have regular brainstorming sessions where the culture is not one of being frightened to bring up suggestions. And Ravi directly has annual reviews with between 500 and 600 staff. So he very much has his finger on the pulse. Now, we've had a number of acquisitions, and there's upside potential. And I asked what challenges this brought him responsible for a workforce whereby the accepted standards were below those of MP Evans. From day one, they explain what they're trying to achieve to bring those yields up to the MP Evans standards, and all the other standards must be observed, including health and safety, which may have been lax or even non-existent. And very often the conditions for the workers are poorer because the plantation hasn't been at its full potential. So if they come in line with the rest of the group, then they too will enjoy the rewards. And they're not just working for anybody now, they're working for MP Evans.
Now, you maintain that there's a lot of employee engagement.
Yeah, what was apparent was a sense of pride, and they were genuinely pleased that somebody was interested in what they did. Now, on the second evening, we were treated to a dinner at the clubhouse, which was attended by a lot of the staff, and we were greeted by some female employees who did a welcoming dance in traditional dress. And it was a very, very moving indeed. And to see, the effort and professionalism that they put into this, and they were also having so much fun, as were their fellow employees, and who showed their appreciation. And later on, a further group of ladies performed a Sumatran dance, and they were joined on the stage by some of the men who couldn't contain their exuberance. And later on, there was some singing. So you can't fake that, Paul.
Right. So, at the end of the day, what do you take away from this visit, Mark?
Well, a great deal. We hear a lot about palm oil, but I've actually visited one of the plantations, and hopefully we can provide some well-needed balance regarding palm oil to counteract a lot of the sloppy and lazy things that are said about it, and the misinformation and misconceptions that abound. And I'll stand toe-to-toe with anybody now. And as I stood behind the chalet at 6 a.m. at the birth of a new day, I surveyed the plantation from the elevation, and with the mist and the birds and the serried ranks of palm oil trees, it really was quite beautiful and mesmeric, and I didn't want to turn away. And as we were leaving the plantation, I doubt, we remember the paper mill, as I was leaving, I doubt the biogas plant was being decommissioned, or that the infants removed from the creche. that the fertilizer was returned to the fertilizer store. The PPR handed back and put into storage. The Red Cross removed the clinic, and the people pretended to be the doctor and nurse going back to harvesting, where the hedgerows and vegetables being ploughed through. The sports court ripped up, the clubhouse dismantled, the bridge taken down, camouflage netting removed to reveal jerry-built houses. These are all permanent features, Paul. And again, I learned a great deal, but I hope the company learned a little from me. And Matthew, in particular, was interested in portfolio management, and I shared what I do and what other retailer investors do. And, I would have been very disappointed if the visit would have consisted of a quick drive past the plantation, and then it's the quad biking, and then a look at the mill, followed by a canoe, and then off to the local bar to sink half a bottle of Jack Daniels. I can do these things elsewhere. I was there to witness the inner workings of a palm oil plantation. So parting really was such sweet sorrow at Jakarta airport, and we said our goodbyes with Matthew, Luke, and Ravi. We left with some kind words, warm handshakes, and a promise to meet again at the AGM in June.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for that review, Mark. It sounded like you had a great experience there. And it has pretty much qualified a lot of the things that we were talking about in part one of this podcast in respect to MP Evans as a producer of sustainable palm oil. If you would like to listen to that, to part one of this podcast, I will put a link in the notes. And for this special two-part podcast, I have paid special attention to the written transcript for YouTube. And by clicking the CC button in the YouTube player, this transcript can be viewed on screen in your preferred language. Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.